Hello, I'm John and MacTavish-Slaton, and today I want to take a look at genetics and family heritage and genealogy. Now, a couple of years ago, as I've stated in other videos, we found out that our paternal haplogroup that we inherit from the father line through grandfather, grandfather, and grandfather, and so far, was not a Scottish, Pictish, or Irish, Ulster, Crinan Gaelic DNA. It wasn't R1b to our shock. It was actually I1M253, which is a Nordic haplogroup that comes from Scandinavia. So since this discovery of DNA, it's been kind of my mission to find how our family came from Scandinavia into Britain and Ireland over 1,000 years ago. So how did we end up here? And where there's scarce records that show any proof of definite families, ancient families and surnames, one thing that was quite apparent is that probably our name was not originally Slaton, and it was probably an adopted name. The first spelling of the name was Slatten or Slaten, or sometimes Slateen. So it was always with an E and not an O as it is now. And it never was with an a Y, S-L-A-Y. Never was it ever in our line and with a D, S-L-A-D. So it was originally S-L-A-T-T-E-N. And the only place in the world where I see this S-L-A-T-T-E-N is in Ballyslaton, which is found in Tipperary in Ireland. Ballyslaton. And a key connection to that is that there is actually right there, probably not even 15 miles, less than 20 kilometers from Ballyslaton, is we see the last Slatons in Ireland, which is Patrick and Mary Slaton and their son Thomas Slaton, who was found close to the Rexford border in Tipperary, so not far from Clonmel. And this was in the 1910 census, and from there we have zero evidence of where this family would have left, but originally the family would have been there from at least the early 1700s in Tipperary, probably the late 1600s. So how did we get to America from George, our first ancestor? We don't have very much information on that. What we do know is that we are a family that grows on the legends of being Norse Gael and Irish and Scottish Pict mixed. Now, many people will point to the fact that, George was possibly married to an old Bissell, which was from Ireland, and his grandson, Azariah, my third great-grandfather, was married to a Landrum that her father was from Scotland and her mother, who was Scottish, and her mother was a Scots-Irish from Ulster. And then their son, which is my second great-grandfather, Francis Morgan Slaton, married a woman of the O'Cours, who their family was from Ireland, and then the Brookes, who were an Anglo-Norman Irish family. So that has been said. That's where we get this idea that perhaps we have those genetics. But going back is the haplogroup, which science changes everything, and that makes us really a Nordic paternal line. Many Gaelic and Pictish lines from the Scots and Irish married in over the last 1,000 years, but our paternal line came from Scandinavia somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 years ago. And that's the journey. And what we see on the screen is Canute's empire. And we're talking about Canute today because we found a key discovery of a distant cousin that's related to us, our closest cousin in the entire world. So we're going to start out with looking at this map, and this is the map. If you see in the shade of this pinkish color would be Canute's empire. As you can see, he controlled all of Denmark, which is the Judas Peninsula, Zealand, Scania, which is the bottom of Gotaland and Sweden, all the way up into the Bosland region and Himland region, and Vermland in Norway. And he also came and conquered England. What you see, he has all of the English territories as well as up into what is Northumbria, above the River Humber, which is, Yorkshire and northern now England, all the way up into the lowlands and midlands on the western side, or the eastern side, all the way up into Edinburgh. So these are two, this is an important region. And going back to the DNA of our Nordic haplogroup, we branch off into a Z141, Z2535 haplogroup. Now, in particular, this haplogroup has its highest percentage of anybody in the world is found right there in Scotland, the Midlands and the lowlands of Scotland. This is the highest concentration by percentage among the population in the world of Z141 down to Z2535 of this Nordic Scandinavian I1M253 haplogroup. If you look at Denmark and you look at Sweden, and if you see the cursor, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a cursor in this region right here. This is called the Kattegat. The Kattegat region is this region of northern Jutland Peninsula, on the eastern side of the Jutland Peninsula, or the Jutland Peninsula, the eastern side of the north of the Jutland Peninsula, right here. And then this is the southwestern side of Sweden. Okay, this section right here, which is what we call West Gotland, part of Scania, part of Bosland, this region. And then you have, so between this little area right here is called the Kattegat region. Okay, and if you look at the people that settled here during the rule of Canute, a lot of people would come from the Scania area right here, and Gotland area of Gotland in Sweden, and possibly, obviously some from Denmark and the Jutland Peninsula, but they would settle right here. And this would be the epicenter of the Z141 haplogroup. And even today, Z2535 is found at the highest concentration right here in Scotland. And probably the next highest level of concentration of this would probably be in the north of England, Yorkshire and Carlisle, all through here, if you can see my cursor. So this is exactly, if you look on the map, is, they would sail across here, where Canute would actually go down into the power base of England, which would be down toward where Mercia was, and Wessex, and through here. This would be where, this area would be where Canute would set up. But he would bring along a man that was somewhat related to him. Canute was married to a man's cousin, by the name of Sigurd the Stout. Sigurd the Stout was the son of Bjorn Bjornsson. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're just looking at where my haplogroup would have arrived in England and in Scotland, which these, they really didn't call it England and Scotland at the time. Scotland would have been known as Alba, and in England would not have existed. It would have been a series of probably different countries. I mean, you could say it was united, but in the sense of what we think modern day England didn't exist. There were several kingdoms. So this is where Z2535's had its highest concentration. Now, there is a clue that when the Angles and the Jutes, the Frisians and the Geats first came into the British Isles, they would also settle these regions outside of down in Kent, but they would also settle mostly this northern section of what would be England today, and southern section of what would be Scotland. So there's evidence that this DNA was already there, but it would also come in Canute's time. Now, the absence of our DNA from earlier time periods in the British Isles would lead me to believe that we weren't a product of the Anglo-Saxon, Frisian, and Jute invasions or settlements. It would lead me to believe that we came along a little bit later, several centuries later, with the Danes and with the Swedes. So, and I would believe that these would probably be people would be classified, if you would go back to the Vendel Age, the Age of Beowulf, they would have been considered the Geats, just another Scandinavian tribe like the Danes, like the Swedes, and like the Norwegians. The problem is the Geats would be the father of the Gothic nations, like the Vandals, the Longobards, the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, all that would come down into Germany, Poland, and spread out all over Europe. and would help bring the end of the Roman Empire. This depletion of fighting warriors would make the Geats lose out eventually, which it took many years past these migrations for them to lose out in the historical content. So the Yeats or the Geats, the Githti or the Goths. But anyways, I do believe that they were the progenitor of the Z2535 and Z141. So how did we get into Britain as a very precarious thing? And I believe that genetics and DNA shows this. And so we're going to come back to this map, and we're going to come back to Sigurd the Stout, who I believe was a mixture of a Scania and Vestgotland Geat with Danish and Swedish heritage. But something in particular happened last year, I believe it was that we made a strong connection to our family, to the Johnstons. Now, the Slatons, like I said, we don't think that's our original name, and we do think there's a connection between how we came from Tipperary with Bally-Slaton, and I believe that Slaton name was used as a surname, and that this man was probably fleeing some type of penalty with the government, and he fled to America. That's kind of my consensus with that. And we also, and I pointed out earlier in other videos, is that the weird thing about Slaton is it's been tried to link up Bally as place of in Gaelic. Or Gaelga. But if you look at Slaton, it seems to be two words put in together in the Irish language, but I don't think so. I think this name is somehow residued with people of the Norse Gaels. And the reason why is if you go to Norway, you go to Sweden, and even Denmark. When I was there last year, I came across several place names throughout Norway and Sweden that had the name Slaton on it, Slatten or Slaten or Slatton. Several, they're all pronounced the same way, but there's different regions in Sweden and Norway that they're pronounced the same way, but they're spelled slightly different with E's and O's and sometimes double T's. And I remember staying more toward the northern section of central Norway. And I remember staying at this ski lodge, this famous ski lodge that's up in the mountains above the fjords. And when the guy saw my surname, he was like, "Oh, okay, you've got Norwegian heritage, right? Your family's probably originally from here. This is why you're visiting." And I was like, I got a few Norwegians in my family tree, but that's not my lineage. It's not my parental lineage. I've actually got some Swedes a little bit closer down the line as great-grandparents, but that's not my family name from them and that. But it was kind of shocking because he said that this is a common name. This Slaton was a common name years ago, but there's not many left in Scandinavia so much. But there's a lot of place names of that. And so that kind of shows that there is a connection in the name, that perhaps this wasn't our surname, but there was a connection to that name and somehow it originated with us. One thing to point out, we're not kin to the northern sections of the Slatons of the Massachusetts or even the Virginia Slatons, the other southern Slatons. DNA shows we're not kin to these Slatons at all. And DNA shows that we're not kin to any Slatons, Slatons, or Slatons, or any variation of that spelling of anyone in England today. So we're going to go back to this on the screen. Johnston. Johnston is a clan that is found in Dumfries. They're of Annandale. And the reason why we're talking about this clan, or I'm talking about this clan, is the fact that we had an individual, a lady, whose brother had tested to us. And out of the southern Slatons here in the States, and then a few that's moved around in the world, such as in Canada and other places, there's been no other surname connected to us outside of Ireland, the surname Ireland found in the United States, and another surname Hoffman, which we know the Hoffman really was, that was their maternal name. They were really genetically a Slaton. So outside of the surname Ireland and the surname Hoffman, no one else in the world is connected to us at a very close branch. Now, our branch goes back and splits below 1890 at 11 A11040 or 41, and this branch splits off roughly, I would say, about 1800 years ago. And so we're talking about roughly around, in my opinion, around 200 AD. And so we have our shared common lineage with a few surnames and families, and two of them would be found in Sweden, which is the Silvergrand and the Harkissons. The next one is found, I think it's the Barkov family in Denmark. And then another one would be a family that is in Germany, but I think they may even have connections to northwestern Germany and southern Denmark. So these four families and surnames are all concentrated there. And then at that same level, we're connected to a couple of families, such as the Eatons, the Popes, who both, I think, are in northern England with connections back to Scotland. And then we have the Moores, and we also have the Webbs with connections to Ulster in Ireland. And then we have the MacQueens, who is a particular interesting one, the MacQueens, who come from Clan MacSween in Scotland. But out of all these, the ones that really, so like I said, it's a couple in Sweden, one in Denmark, one in northern Germany, and then you bounce over to Britain, where you have, several near, kind of northern families in England, and then you have a couple in Scotland, a couple in Ireland, and then us in England, or in America. So the Johnston really stuck out because this is the first time last year that this family was connected to ours, and it is the closest family to ours. And incredibly, this is a family that might have split off from us in the 15 or 1600s. So her brother took this test, has this name Johnston. Now, Johnston has several. If you go to their family tree Y-DNA group, you have a lot of different Johnstons. Now, the group carries the name Johnson, Johnstone, and Johnston. So there's 4 to 5 different spellings. They also have some of the Johnsons from Sweden in the group. So the DNA is all over the place. You have DNA that looks to be Scandinavian. You have DNA that looks to be Norse. You have DNA that looks to be perhaps of Anglo-Saxon roots. You have DNA that looks to be of Celtic and Pictish roots. You have DNA that looks to be, Brythonic, Celt, So the DNA, who was John, the first John, and how did the sons come after him? Well, in particular, this family's not truly kin to any of the Johnstons. Not in that sense, because the man by the name of John was in Dumfries, and he had a town. That's where we get the word town. So when you have, village and then town, when you get the word town or ton from this, and it just means dwelling of, just like Slaton is really Slate Town, which just means slay, which was a man by the name of Slay or Sly that was in a ton, right? And, he was there in the 1100s in Dumfries, and probably late 1100s, mid to late 1100s. And he was, he's the one that that this place is named after. It's named after John's ton, and that's where you get the name Johnston. And it's also morphed into Johnstone as well. And I think it's just the pronunciations in Scotland of pun and tan that would change the spelling. So this was very, very interesting, because this lady whose brother tested with this, unfortunately, I know she had been sick, and my middle connection with her doesn't exist. I need to contact her, find a way to contact her, and hopefully she's doing well, but the last time I heard she wasn't doing very well. But her brother had did one of these tests, and I guess apparently passed away, but he's on Family Tree DNA as one of the closest ones to our family, but we don't have, it's one of these mysteries where we don't have a surname and we don't have a country of origin. But according to her in the family records, she's living in I believe, Yorkshire. northern England. But her family had came over, I believe, sometime in the early 1900s from Ireland. And they were a family that was in Ireland for several centuries, and they themselves were originally from Scotland. So this is really kind of interesting because as you see migrational with genetic traits move around, this is our closest cousin. And going back to these cousins branched off at A1890 down to A 11040 or 41, 45. I don't quite remember exactly. But if you look at these guys, we came from Scandinavia, and we were originally in the area of Sweden, and I would say Gotaland. This is, the lakes of Vernum and all through there. We were originally from there, migrated south into Västergötland and to Boslin and down into Scania. And the Silvergrens and the Harkissons would be the ones that were there 1,800 years ago, 1,500 years ago, 1,600 years ago, and stayed. And then you would have another branch that would come down into what would be Zealand, from Scania to Zealand, possibly over to the Jutland Peninsula. And those people would stay. That would be the Bakhoffs. And then you have another one that would travel down through the Jutland Peninsula and probably to provinces that used to be Denmark 150 years ago, but are now part of Germany. And they would migrate there. Ours, however, would be the area that left this southern Scandinavian area and would travel into the British Isles and then on into Ireland. So this family's connection here is pretty neat because it shows a family that was found in Scotland that came into Ireland, that then came into England, as our family possibly was from Scotland, that came into Ireland and onto America. So this is a split, and this split shows possibly of that. Now, it's fascinating because DNA does show a high level of Z2535 right there in the lowlands and midlands of Scotland. So as we're on my mother's side, they were mainly Highlander Scots from the west of Scotland and Argyll and Hebrides, such as the MacDougals, the MacTavishes, the Campbells, the MacGregors, the MacCallums, MacLeods. This part of the family would actually be from the upper lowlands or the midlands, and would be stretched from all the way from the Dumfries and Border region in Annadale all the way up into Aberdeenshire, up in Aberdeen, which is north of Edinburgh on the eastern side of Scotland. So the family was, branched through different parts of the family. So I think this is fascinating that this is a close connection of who we were. And like I said, so if you see my cursor, originally we were from this area. And we could have came down into Denmark and then came over into what we call Northumbria and settled right there, eventually settling right around this region of considered Western Scotland right here along the borders in Dumfries and Annadale. And then the family would kind of move up into here into Urk, and then move up here into Aberdeen. And then another branch of this family would actually move over into one of the isles off the west coast of Scotland. And we'll get with that in a little bit. So going back to this is the English and Scottish settlements of Ulster during the 15th and during the 16th, 17th century. So this would be the late 1500s and then throughout the 1600s in Ulster. And then you would see the surname distribution, and this is just Johnston. I don't know if this is Johnstone or not, but this is the name spelt that way. So if you look at the distribution, they're found really everywhere in every county there. Predominantly, they're mostly found in Antrim down Fermanagh, and then through Derry, Donegal, Tyrone, and so forth. They've even come over into Mayo and Sligo. So this is in the 1600s, it was a predominant surname throughout mid to North Ireland. And then going back to show you, we're going to go back on this screen. So you see where my cursor is, this little indentation right here. This is, on this side is Carlisle, in England. On this side is Dumfries. And this is where they would be. Now you would see it in more particular on this clan map. This is that land right there, the Johnstons. And now they were surrounded by many infamous names, such as the Grahams, the Elliots, the Gordons, the Macmillans, the Dunbars, the Maxwells, Scots, the Kays, the Kennedys. See, these people, the Kerrs, these are all in this region. And they were, and this is the land right here that borders northern England. And so from here, the clan would actually have a branch that would spread out to around this region, and then all the way up into this region. They would settle in Aberdeen. And then history has it they would also come over and settle on one of these islands on the either side of Argyll. And here's another map that shows the old families and clans. And here's Johnstons, and they are surrounded by really pretty much their enemies, such as the Armstrongs, the Elliots, and the Maxwells. And then over here we got the McDougalls, the Kennedys, the Stewarts, the Cunninghams, the Montgomerys, the Lindsays, and so forth. One very powerful clan would be the Douglases. Also, you have the Kirkpatricks. Now, one thing interesting to note is that people always seem to talk about William Wallace and portray him as a Highlander in a kilt, which I love the movie Braveheart, but first of all, William Wallace was not a Highlander, and probably didn't wear a kilt. Now, he may have wore some type of tartan, because even the lowland Scots and the midland Scots had tartan. This was a very predominant Celtic thing. I think it was found probably among the Brythonic Celts. It was found among the Pictish Celts. It was found among the Gaels and the Cluny Picts in Ireland. So the tartan would have been used by all these clans. So probably by this time of the Scottish War of Independence, William Wallace would probably have his family, the Wallace family, would have had probably had a tartan of their own, because all these families were truly clans. They weren't, and the reason the lowland clans never probably don't get the attention as the Highlanders, because the Highlanders would make them famous would be the Jacobite uprisings. The Jacobite uprisings made the clan system famous from the Highlanders and their tartans and all this other stuff, bagpipes, would make it famous because they were resistance to British or English and British rule, and they would actually be outlawed. Many of their clan systems would be outlawed, the tartans would be outlawed, and so forth. And then it was romanticized by an English king, George, and also by many writers such as Scott. So this is the homeland of the Johnstons. Now we're going to go back to look at possible origins of the Johnstons. And an incredible story. We know that they're right there in Annandale. Now, there's a couple of possibilities about these people. One is the fact that many people theorize that they may have been already there in this area that was, it was right there on the border of Northumbria. So these people would have lived on the border of Northumbria, England, and Scotland, saddling this border. So if they were the original people there, that they would have been people that might have been brought in this Nordic Catholic group by the Angles, Jutes, Geats, Swedes, Danes from the first arrival of the so-called Anglo-Saxon invasion. or settlements. If they were not people from, the 5 and 600 AD region, then perhaps they came during the Great Heathen Army. The problem with the Great Heathen Army is that we don't see a lot of genetic interference or this introduction of the Norse genes during this time period. Even though they controlled most of Northumbria and central and northern England and southern Scotland for a good while, we don't see this massive genetic imprint there. And one reason why is the fact that most of these males would, these were fighting individuals, and they were, I don't know, maybe they didn't have as big as influence as we think as far as settlement. But we do know that, after Danelaw, when we have the next invasion of Canute purposely would bring in an entourage from Denmark and Sweden and Norway into England and what would become Scotland. And he sent a guy that was married to his cousin. Or I'm sorry, he was married to this guy's cousin. That's Sigurd the Stout. And so this is how we believe that it was amongst Sigurd the Stout's settlement in Yorkshire, in Northumbria, all the way up into Bernicia, which would be up into Scotland, all the way into Edinburgh, that these people arrived with him, and then this is where the Johnstons get their DNA. Now, legend has it that they themselves were descendant of Sigurd the Stout, and Sigurd the Stout was married to the Earl of Bamburgh. If you watched the Last Kingdom, you would know a little bit about that history, but he was married to the Earl of Bamburgh. I think his name was Ulfric the Bold's granddaughter. He was married to Ulfric the Bold's granddaughter. Ulfric, I don't know how to sound it, but anyways, he was married to this guy's granddaughter. So it solidified his power in the north of England and the south of Scotland, in Northumbria, and he made his power base there in York. And his son would be this half Anglo and half Danish, Yiddish, Swedish guy. And it would be through that lineage that I believe it was either his son was Rolf, and I think his grandson would actually marry King Donald's daughter or granddaughter of Scotland. So there's a couple of things happen there. It's that the fact that Sigurd would support Malcolm Cranmore's invasion of Scotland, where this guy would actually, Sigurd the Stout, this Dane, I would say he'd probably be a Dane, Swede, Yiddish mixed man, would invade Macbeth's kingdom and defeat Macbeth and drive Macbeth up north, far north. And he would take this area around north central Scotland, and he would give it over. And eventually Macbeth would come back and take this back, but it was short-lived, as Duncan's descendants would eventually take back the throne of Alba or Scotland. So within this, we have this connection to this man being heavily involved in Scottish politics, and he would have been also, his descendants being married into royalty. Later on, his descendants, especially his son and grandson, would be involved in many conflicts with the Normans. And this conflict pushed some of these guys into Scotland, with several, settling north of Edinburgh. We've known the Sidwards. So, Sidwards were around there, and they're all connected to this family, the Johnstons, the Sidwards. And then later on, you would have this family permanently relocate to the Scottish side of the border. They had lands on both sides, but it's unsure if they left their English side behind and settled in the Scottish side fully due to the conflicts with the Norman kings, or did they just arrive with the Normans themselves when the Normans that were settling in the north of England would have came with King David, the Irish king, into Scotland. But we do know is that the De Bruces would be given lands in Annandale. Now, the Bruces also had lands in Huntingdon, Huntington, and both these areas were Sigurd the Stout's domains. So in particular, there is a close relationship between the Johnstons and these Normans that would come up through England into Scotland and be given lands. Nevertheless, one of these descendants would be called John, and his dwelling place, his farm, his little community would be called Johnston. And that's where it begins. Is he a true great-grandson of Sigurd the Stout? Ooh, I don't know. But I do believe he came in with the same people of Sigurd the Stout, and I believe this genetic people would have been the people transported from Denmark and Sweden into Canute's domain, where Sigurd ruled in Northumbria as Earl. So who was Sigurd the Stout if he is the originator of the Johnstons? Well, the Johnstons are not the only ones that claim a descent from a Norse ruler of Northumbria. Many claim this. Many claim to be kin to Sigurd. Many claim to be kin to Eric the Blood Axe during the end of Danelaw, who was also a Norse ruler. Several are said to be kin to these individuals, and these guys, such as the Lyons, the Hamiltons, the Fairborns, the Armstrongs, and also the Johnstons themselves, claim a kinship to a Norse or a Daneman that was a ruler of Northumbria, which would have been a ruler of a section of southern Scotland, from the Midlands down to the Lowlands. And so many of these families have this DNA. Now, a lot of these people don't have any DNA to the Norse from Norway, the R1A, or even the I haplogroup Z60, Z74 perhaps, or whatever branch off is that. Most of them have this Z141 branch. A lot of them have the Z141 branch, Z2535. And that, in my opinion, was found in a concentration of in probably Scania in Sweden and Western Gotland, and it's spread out through some sections of southern Norway, over into the Zealand Peninsula and into the Zealand Island and the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark, and down into northwestern Germany. Some probably in the Baltic coast, mainly going into the Frisian coastline. So if it's true the Johnstons are originated from Sigurd, or perhaps a member of Sigurd's family, or that same genetic group, then who is Sigurd the Stout? Well, Sigurd the Stout is a man that is, he is found born probably somewhere in the Kattegat region. I think the historical sagas say that he is from Roskilde in Zealand, but his pedigree shows that his paternal lineage comes from Scania, and Scania was under the control of Denmark at this time in southern Sweden, and also Gotaland and Västergötland. So all this was a connection to where his family would have been from, and we, take a look at who his, possibly who his father was. And this is if I can get a large enough picture on the screen, that's kind of small. There's only a few paintings of this guy, but here is the grave. It's very, very small. I don't think I can blow it up. But anyways, there is nothing large, but this is a coin of Sigurd of Northumbria. Now, another clan in Scotland, you have the Armstrongs, the Fairborns, the Johnstons, the Balfours, also in connected with Sigurd's are claimed descent from this man. So what was his pedigree? Who was he and where was he from? And I think that if we look at that, he is a man found, he was a man that was the son of Bjorn Bjornsson. And Bjorn Bjornsson is a man that is believed to be from Scania. And this is a photo, which isn't a very big one. Let me see if I can blow it up. But, he was said to be on his deathbed wanting to go as a warrior. He had gotten sick. probably dysentery or some kind of illness, and he wanted to die in battle. That wasn't going to be the case, so he wanted to die in full gear. So here he is in full gear with a spear, his Norse helmet, his shield, sword. He dies, and in particular, why we kind of blow that up a little bit. And here he is there, the man in the middle, and we don't know if this is, his children or not. So Sigurd is the son of Bjorn Bjornsson. Bjorn was supposedly born in Scania, and Bjorn's father, also known as Threobjorn, and Threobjorn, Bjorn, it means Threo, I believe, means wild, or untamed, unruly individual, or that's just a way of saying it. And Bjorn means bear, so this means kind of like the wild bear, the unruly bear. And Styrbjorn, which was his grandfather, was the son of Olaf. He was Bjorn Styrbjorn Olafsson, and Olaf was the king, a Swedish king. If you look at the genealogy and where he was placed in the sagas, he's placed right there in Gotaland, and it would mean he was probably a Geat who became king of the Swedes. And legendary says that they descended from Bjorn Ironsides, one of the legendary historical figures. I think he's historical. He's in all the sagas. He would be part of the Great Heathen Army. He would also fight many battles around Britain, and he would later come into back into Scandinavia and fight in a battle in Sweden, which would have maybe put him as his descendants as some of the kings in Sweden. Was he really a son of Ragnar Lothbrok? I don't know. There's no proof. That's too hard to get, and that's not what this is about. But so if you look at Sigurd's pedigree, he was a great grandson of the Swedish King Olaf. And these guys, Olaf, Styrbjorn, Bjorn, they married into Danish and Swedish princely lines. So they were marrying Swedish and Danish princesses that were connected to the ruling families, these petty kingdoms that were found all over Sweden, all over Denmark, and probably even Norway. And they would what brought Sigurd to Northumbria was that Canute was married to his cousin. Now, it's also even speculated that Canute and Sigurd were cousins, straight out blood right, that they may have shared the same paternal grandmother, like a great-great-grandmother. Fascinating history, but to make this go into line to where we've spent talking with me is the fact that you have perhaps, and maybe DNA one day will show us a more clear picture, that if we go back to the we go back to the 700s, 800s, early 900s, we have a family that lives there in what is now southern Sweden. They have Scania connections. They're in Gotaland. They're probably what we call West Geats. And Olaf, a king of the Swedes, through his lineage of Styrbjorn to Bjorn, all the way to Sigurd, who would come over to Britain with Canute and would be given control of Northumbria, and would probably rule almost in his own right as a king. From there, his family, and probably these noblemen from Denmark and Sweden around him would spread out and become very powerful families. And some of the Scottish clans, I mean, we know a lot of the clans are families were Norman, such as the Montgomerys, the St. Clairs, the Bruces, and so forth. And the Stuarts themselves were from Brittany. They were Britons over in France, or what is now France. And so, but what's misunderstood is that so many of the families in the Midlands, in central Scotland, in the lowlands, in the border regions, so many of these families are actually connected to Anglo-Saxon dynasty of Northumbria, and then also to the Norse, Danes, Swedes, Norwegians that had came in during the time of the Great Heathen Army and the Danelaw. And I think what we see in later times with Canute is that these guys that wielded these powerful families in southern to mid Scotland were actually part of this entourage that arrived with Sigurd or Sigurd's families. And even more of these people would be brought up along with the Normans a couple of, into the next century. So that's fascinating. So if you look at our line and you look at this line that we belong to, that originated over here in this region of, I would say, where the cursor is, this is what we call Gotaland. It's not pictured, but there's two very large maps right here. And from south of these two lakes all the way through this region is the epicenter of my genetics, where my paternal grandfather would have been, at least, as early as 200 AD, and sometime probably in the 1000s, come over here with Canute. And there's a lot of these people called the Geats, the Gults, the Gilter, along with the Scanians, which were a mixture of Danes and Geats and Swedes, would come, and with Norwegians as well, would come here, settle as a descendant of King Olaf of Sweden. And these people would eventually, that settled right here in southern Scotland and would venture up into Aberdeenshire, would have a son by the name of John, and Johnstown would be called Johnstown. Now, the Mac Eoins is a very particular family, because in Scottish Gaelic, Mac Eoin, or Mac Eoin, or Mac Eoin, Mac Eoin, I mean, there's, my American pronunciation's probably not doing it justice, but the Mac Eoins are really the family that left this family right here that's found in Annadale. But there's several that went to Erk, some to Aberdeenshire. But there was ones that went west, that particularly would have settled in one of these islands. I don't remember which one, but they would consider themselves Johnstons in English, but they would have changed their name to the Mac Eoins, so they would take the Scottish Gaelic name, Mac Eoin, and eventually these people would have left here as either one, as Gallaglass, and would have settled here in Ulster, and that means they would have probably came sometime between the mid-1200s to about the mid-1500s as Gallaglass from the west of Scotland as Mac Eoins. And or the second thing is that they could have came with the other Johnstons during the plantation era, which would be the late 1500s through the early 1700s. But I think that those Johnstons were mainly found as lowlanders that would came in during the plantation era in the late 1500s to the early 1700s. I think that the kinfolk, distant cousins of these individuals that were of Norse stock, that intermarried into Gaelic families, and other families there that would have migrated over here to one of these islands, would have came over probably when there was a lot of wars going on against the Normans in Ireland. And so you would have these guys come in and settle. And another possibility too, if they didn't come over as Gallaglass, they may have came over with a warren factor of Edward the Bruce, because many of the people from like Ayrshire, right here, Ayrshire, and other places, this is where the de Bruces would have heavily recruited in this area, and could have picked up the Mac Eoins that transported them there. So luckily for us that this lady reached out and saw where her brother's Y-DNA results matched down with ours, which would have put us back sometime probably, I believe, between the 15 and 1600s. So, and that would have put us here, and then, a couple centuries later, descendants of this family would go to America, and then descendants of this family would come back over into the north of England. So fascinating stuff when you go to a timeline and geographical aspect of where these individuals would have came from right here in the southern of Scotland, then come over here into Ulster. But I believe that these people would have traveled here over into the island and settled and take up the Gaelic language, and would be called the Mac Eoins. And then eventually, either with possibly as Galaglass, or even with Edward the Bruce's horde, would have settled in these regions, and eventually settled, moved out of that. So Olaf, probably sometime in the late 800s, early 900s in Sweden, all the way down to Sturlbrunn Olafsson in Scania, whose connections to West Gotland right through here in Gotaland, all the way down to Bjorn Bjornsson and his son Sigurd, would be born right here, I think in Roskilde in Zealand in Denmark. Would come over with Canute, I think, in the early 1000 AD, and would be given this domain from the Yorkshire and Daria of Northumbria, from around this region all the way up to Bernicia, which was kind of this borderland all the way up in Edinburgh. That would be his domain. And from his descendants, he would become the Johnstons, that would eventually become the Mac Eoins, that would eventually become turn back into Johnsons, who would eventually come into England and then come into America. So more DNA tests are needed to finalize this and try to understand it better. But we do have our closest connection. It is from an individual by the name of Johnston, family records in Ulster that have come originally from Scotland, and it ties into all these legends. And when you look at the Z2535, its hyperpoint in the world is right there in Scotland. And the only way this section of the Nordic haplogroup could ever came in would have been, either with the Jutes or the Geats and the Angles, or it could have came in during Danelaw. And in my opinion, my particular line, I believe to think that a lot of these family histories, there is a lot of truth to them, and that we descend from the Olafssons of Gotaland and Sweden, and that we were probably this Geatish Swedish people mixed with Danes, and we came over to Britain, where we mixed with the Angles, and then we'd eventually and also the Brythonic Breton Celtic peoples, possibly Cumbria and the original people, or not original, but the ones before the arrival of the Angles, and then mixed with the people of the Picts and the people of the Gaels and the Crinean Scots. So fascinating stuff. Hopefully more people come forward and test, so we can get things put together and try to formulate a better timeline and produce a documentary type movie on some of these rare haplogroups that branched off and have these dead-end brick walls. So anyways, thanks for watching. Loved if you have any Slaton surnames or Johnston surnames, Armstrong, Hamilton, Lyon, Balfour, Eaton, Pope, Ireland, Webb, Moore, any of these surnames, or even the Beckhoff or Silvergren or Olafsson, and any of these surnames, be very, very interested in talking and reaching out and trying to compare DNA and family history and lore. As always, thanks for watching.